I've seen men lose money. I've seen men lose pride. I've seen them slam their fists into tables, curse their luck, blame the cards, blame God, blame anyone who wasn't sitting across from them. I've seen grown men cry over chips like they were pieces of their own body. But in New Orleans, I watched a man lose something he couldn't get back. He didn't scream. He didn't fight. He didn't even fall. One moment he was sitting there, cards in his hands, eyes fixed on them, felt like he was trying to memorize it. The next, the cards slipped from his fingers, landed face down, and he simply stopped. Stopped breathing, stopped blinking, stopped being part of the game. Right there at the table. At first, I thought he was acting, some kind of trick, a way to delay the hand, buy a few seconds, maybe force a reaction. I'd already learned by then that poker attracts men who lie with their entire bodies. But nobody reacted. That's what told me this was different. No one rushed to him. No one shouted his name. No one stood up in panic or reached for help. The room didn't explode into chaos the way you'd expect when death walks in uninvited. Instead, the table went quiet, not shocked, not afraid. Respectful. Like everyone had been waiting for this moment and was simply acknowledging that it had finally arrived. Someone gently took the cards from his lifeless hand and stacked them neatly. Someone else reached over and straightened the chips in front of him, as if order still mattered. A third man closed the dead man's eyes with 2 fingers, careful and precise, like he'd done it before. The dealer didn't look up. The game paused for exactly as long as it needed to. No more, no less. And that's when I understood something that still makes my stomach tighten when I think about it. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a medical emergency that happened to interrupt a poker game. This was a conclusion. I had been invited to New Orleans because someone wanted me to see this. Not the death itself, but what surrounded it. The calm, the control, the way the table absorbed what had happened without flinching. I felt my mouth go dry, but my hands stayed steady. That scared me more than anything else. Because a few months earlier, I would have stood up. I would have said something. I would have walked away. That night, I stayed seated. I didn't look at the man's face again. I didn't ask his name. I didn't ask if someone was calling the police or an ambulance or a priest. I didn't ask anything that would slow the room down. I waited. And when the dealer finally spoke, his voice was calm, almost gentle. "Gentlemen," he said, "we'll take a short break." That was it. No explanation, and no acknowledgement of death. Just a pause like the game itself needed to stretch its legs. I stepped back from the table and realized my legs felt weak, not from fear, but from something colder, a kind of clarity I hadn't asked for. This was the night I learned the difference between danger and permission. In Oklahoma City, I thought the invitation meant opportunity, access, bigger games, better money. I thought it meant someone had noticed my skill, my nerve, my willingness to adapt. But New Orleans showed me the truth. The invitation wasn't about how well you played. It was about what you were willing to witness and still come back for. Because this table didn't kill that man. The table simply allowed him to finish dying in public. And everyone there understood the rule without it ever being spoken. If you sit down, you accept the outcome. As the music from the club downstairs drifted up through the floorboards, slow jazz, heavy and alive, the contrast felt obscene. The city was celebrating, breathing, sweating, laughing, while upstairs, a man's life had ended without interrupting a single tradition. New Orleans doesn't hide its sins. It displays them. And that's why it's dangerous. Not because bad things happen there, but because they happen with witnesses who don't interfere. As I stood there, surrounded by men who treated death like a closed hand, I realized something else. No one was watching the body anymore. They were watching me. Not to see if I was scared, but to see if I understood. Stay with me, because this was the night I learned what the invitation really meant. And once you understand it, you can't pretend you don't. The city that doesn't forget sins. New Orleans doesn't announce itself. It seeps into you. It gets under your skin through heat and sound and smell, through music leaking out of cracked doors, through sweat that never fully dries, through the slow understanding that nothing here is accidental. Not the streets, not the people, not the silence that settles in certain rooms when someone important walks in. This is a city that stays awake even when it sleeps. Alive not in a healthy way, but in the way something wounded refuses to die. Breathing through jazz, alcohol, confession, and memory. The air hangs heavy, thick with humidity and history, like every breath carries something left behind by someone else. New Orleans remembers. That's the first thing you feel. Not nostalgia. Memory. Other cities bury their sins. They build over them, rename streets, rewrite stories. New Orleans doesn't bother. It leaves them exposed, polished just enough to look respectable. Here, corruption isn't hidden. It's managed, ritualized, given rules. The city is morally loose, everyone knows that. Nobody pretends otherwise. Desire is visible. Temptation is advertised. Vices aren't whispered about. They're sold with neon signs and live music. But socially, New Orleans is strict. There are ways to behave, ways to enter a room, ways to speak, sit, listen, and leave. Break those rules, and the city doesn't punish you loudly. It remembers you. And that's worse. Poker in New Orleans isn't gambling. It's ritual. It's performance. It's hierarchy. In Oklahoma City, poker felt like a contest. Skill versus chance. Nerve versus discipline. You win or you lose. You pay or you leave. Clean lines. Clean exits. In New Orleans, the game begins long before the cards hit the felt. It begins with who invites you, with where you're asked to sit, with who pours your drink and who doesn't. Poker here is theater, and everyone knows their role. The dealer isn't just a dealer, he's a conductor. The players aren't equals. They're positioned pieces in a living structure. The table itself feels older than the building it sits in, like it's absorbed decades of tension, secrets, and silent agreements. In New Orleans, nobody pretends the game is clean. They just pretend it's polite. That sentence floated through my mind the first night I arrived, though no one had said it out loud. It wasn't advice. It was an observation, something the city itself communicates if you're paying attention. Politeness matters here. Not kindness. Politeness. You can ruin a man financially, socially, spiritually, as long as you do it with manners. That's what makes it dangerous. I arrived in New Orleans knowing I was expected. That was new. In other cities, I'd always been a variable, a question mark, someone who might sit down, walk away, disappear without consequence. Here, my name had already been spoken. Not loudly, not officially, but enough. Doors opened without hesitation. Nods came before introductions. My presence didn't cause curiosity, it caused recognition, and recognition carries weight. I wasn't arriving as a drifter chasing higher stakes. I was arriving as a continuation. That realization crept in slowly, through small moments. The way a man at the bar glanced at me and looked away, satisfied. The way the hostess didn't ask my name. The way a dealer smiled just a second longer than necessary, like he was checking something off an invisible list. New Orleans had already decided who I was supposed to be. And it was up to me not to disappoint it. The poker rooms here don't feel hidden, even when they are. You don't stumble into them. You're guided gently, politely, firmly, up a staircase that smells faintly of smoke and old wood, through a hallway where the music fades and something heavier takes its place. Silence, but not emptiness. Expectation. Inside, the rooms feel insulated from time. No windows, no clocks. Light designed to focus attention inward, onto the table, onto hands, onto faces that reveal more than they intend. Men sit straighter here. They speak less. Even laughter sounds rehearsed, like it's been approved in advance. Because in New Orleans, reputation sits at the table with you. Every chip you touch carries a memory. Every hand you play echoes something that's already happened to someone else. You're not just betting money, you're negotiating how you'll be remembered. That's why nobody rushes. Urgency is a sign of weakness. Confidence is expressed through patience. And patience is terrifying. I noticed something else too. People watched the room more than the cards. They tracked reactions, posture, breathing. They noticed who hesitated before calling, who avoided eye contact after winning, who touched their face when pressure rose. Information mattered more than outcomes. Because outcomes change, behavior doesn't. This wasn't about luck. It was about control. And the city itself enforced it. Outside, New Orleans pulsed with life. Laughter spilled onto sidewalks. Music wrapped itself around corners. Tourists chased experiences they wouldn't remember clearly in the morning. Inside these rooms, memory was currency. And everyone here remembered everything. That's the paradox of New Orleans. It invites excess but demands discipline. It allows sin but tracks it meticulously. It lets you believe you're free right up until the moment you realize how carefully your choices are being cataloged. By the time I sat down at my first serious table in the city, I understood something that hadn't been clear before. This wasn't about how good I was at poker. It was about whether I could exist comfortably inside a system that didn't care about fairness, only balance. The house didn't need to cheat. The structure itself did the work. Men lost slowly here, deliberately, with dignity intact, and futures quietly rearranged. Winners didn't celebrate. They absorbed the result like it was expected because often it was. And somewhere between the shuffle of cards and the clink of chips, I felt it. The sense that the city doesn't forgive. It doesn't absolve. It doesn't forget. It watches who you become when the pressure is polite and the danger is silent. That's why what happened later, what you already know is coming, didn't shock the room. It confirmed it. Because in New Orleans, consequences don't arrive like lightning. They arrive like an appointment. And everyone who sits down knows, on some level, that the city is keeping score even when the table isn't. As I looked around that room, at men who had learned how to lose without protest and win without joy, I felt the tension tighten. Not fear. Anticipation. Because once you understand how the city works, you realize something unsettling. You're never just playing the game. You're auditioning for what happens next. And the city is always watching. The room above the music. The music reached the room before I did. Not clearly, not as melody or rhythm, but as pressure. A low, pulsing presence that traveled upward through wood and dust and time. Jazz bleeding through the floorboards like a slow heartbeat, reminding everyone upstairs that the city was alive beneath them. Downstairs, New Orleans was drinking, laughing, confessing. Upstairs, it was remembering. The staircase was narrow, worn down in the center from decades of careful footsteps. Each step creaked just enough to announce your movement without revealing your intentions. The walls were close, painted a color that might once have been white. The smell changed as you climbed. Less perfume, more smoke. Less sweat, more age. By the time I reached the top, the music had softened into something almost intimate. A muted trumpet, a lazy piano, sound filtered through layers of wood and history, distorted into something heavier than entertainment. The door at the top wasn't locked. It didn't need to be. Inside, the room waited. The ceiling fan turned slowly, barely moving. The air, not broken, intentional, enough motion to justify its presence, not enough to provide comfort. The heat lingered, trapped, clinging to skin and fabric. Sweat didn't evaporate here, it collected. Glasses sat on the table and along the walls, sweating just like the men holding them. Whiskey diluted by melting ice, condensation pooling at the base, leaving circular marks like ghosts of previous nights. Nobody wiped them away. Nothing here was cleaned in a hurry. The room itself was rectangular, long rather than wide, with walls that absorbed sound instead of reflecting it. No windows, no decorations, just wood, smoke, and light, shaped to focus attention inward. At the center sat the table. It was old, not antique, used, heavy enough that no one ever thought to move, scarred with shallow cuts and dents from rings, watches, nervous hands. The felt had been replaced more than once, but the wood beneath it carried every memory. This table had hosted arguments that ended friendships, deals that reshaped lives, silences that said more than threats ever could. You didn't sit at it casually. You approached it. The chairs were solid, unpadded, designed to keep you aware of your body, of your posture, of how long you'd been there. Comfort encourages carelessness, and carelessness has no place in this room. The players were already seated. Fewer men than I expected. That was the first sign this game mattered. Big games don't need crowds. They need witnesses who understand what they're watching. The men spoke quietly, if at all. Conversations were short, functional. No jokes, no stories, no unnecessary laughter. Words were treated like currency, spent only when the return was clear. Their posture told me everything. Straight backs, relaxed shoulders, hands resting calmly, never fidgeting. These were men who had learned how to wait without tension. Men who understood that impatience is a confession. They didn't look at me all at once. That mattered. One by one, subtle glances, assessments, not challenges. I wasn't being measured for threat, I was being measured for fit. Nobody introduced themselves. That told me everything. Introductions are for equals, or for men who expect not to see each other again. In this room, names weren't necessary. Reputation did the talking. If you were here, you belonged at least provisionally. And if you didn't belong, you wouldn't be here long enough for your name to matter. The dealer stood, not sat, slightly apart from the table like a referee who didn't pretend neutrality. His movements were precise, economical, no wasted gestures. He didn't look bored. He didn't look excited. He looked permanent. Cards slid across the felt with the sound I felt more than heard. Chips stacked with practiced indifference, their weight and texture familiar to hands that had held them for years. Nobody splashed the pot. Nobody counted their chips obsessively. They already knew what they had. I took my seat without ceremony. No one acknowledged it directly. The game adjusted around me like water accommodating a new stone. The rhythm didn't change, it absorbed. That's when I noticed something else. The silence wasn't empty. It was curated. Every pause felt intentional. Every breath registered. The room listened to itself, to the scrape of a chair leg, to the clink of ice in a glass, to the faint trumpet line drifting up from below, bending around the moment like a reminder that this wasn't the only world in existence, just the one that mattered right now. The stakes were higher than anything I'd played before. Not because of the numbers, though they were significant, but because of what losing meant here. Money was only the surface layer. What sat beneath it was access, position, the unspoken understanding that this table could open doors, or quietly close them. I felt it then, the sense that this room didn't tolerate improvisation. Every man here had already decided who he was. The game wasn't about discovering that. It was about testing whether those decisions held under pressure. As the first hands played out, I watched more than I participated. Not out of fear, out of respect. The room demanded observation before action. The patterns revealed themselves slowly. Who bet to control the tempo? Who let others speak through chips? Who never raised without already knowing the answer? Nobody chased. Nobody bluffed loudly. This was poker stripped of performance for outsiders, refined into something almost ceremonial. Above us, the music swelled and dipped. A singer's voice reached up through the floorboards, strained with longing, then faded. Applause followed, muffled and distant. Life went on downstairs. Up here, it was suspended. I realized then that this room wasn't hidden to avoid attention. It was elevated to separate intention. You didn't come here by accident. You came because someone wanted to see how you behaved when comfort was removed and consequences were implied rather than stated. Every man at the table knew that someone else not present cared about the outcome. That's what made the air feel heavy. Not threat. Oversight. As I picked up my cards for the first time, I felt the shift inside myself, the subtle alignment that happens when instinct and environment agree. This was where the road had been leading. Not to a bigger game, to a quieter one. And as the hand unfolded, as chips moved and I stayed level, I understood something that tightened my chest just a little. This table didn't need violence. It didn't need chaos. It didn't need anyone to raise their voice. It only needed time. Because whatever happened here would follow you when you left the room. And the music downstairs would keep playing. As if nothing important had occurred at all. Something is different. Something felt wrong. Not loud enough to alarm me. Not obvious enough to name. Just wrong. It crept in between hands, settled into the pauses, hid inside the silences that lasted half a second longer than they should have. The kind of wrong you don't notice until your body reacts before your mind does. I'd been at the table long enough to know when a room was tense. This wasn't tension. This was direction. The dealer never looked up. That was the first thing. Most dealers glance around occasionally, not out of curiosity, out of habit. A quick scan of faces, chips, posture. It's unconscious, human. This man didn't do that. His eyes stayed on the felt, on the cards, on the mechanics of the game, perfectly focused, perfectly contained, like nothing else in the room required his attention. Like everything that mattered had already been decided. I tried to tell myself it meant nothing. Then I noticed the man to my left kept checking the door. Not anxiously, not openly, just enough to register. Every few minutes, his eyes flicked toward it, the same way someone glances at a clock they already know the time on. He wasn't waiting for someone to arrive. He was waiting for something to end. Across the table, another man hadn't touched his drink. The glass sat there untouched, ice melting slowly, condensation pulling beneath it. Anyone else would have taken at least a sip by now, out of habit, out of nerves, out of something. But his hands never went near it. He kept them folded neatly when he wasn't playing a hand. Controlled, reserved, as if drinking would break a discipline he couldn't afford to lose. And then there was the nervous one. Middle-aged, well-dressed, too well-dressed. The kind of suit someone buys to look like they belong in rooms they've only imagined. The fabric still held sharp creases, like it hadn't learned his body yet. His hands shook. Not constantly, just when he thought no one was looking. That's how you know it's real. He tried to hide it by keeping his fingers busy stacking chips, aligning them, breaking stacks, and rebuilding them again. But the tremor slipped through in small moments. When he reached for his cards, when he pushed chips forward, when he adjusted his cuffs. He was losing. Slowly. Not unfairly. Relentlessly. No bad beats. No dramatic hands. No moments of outrage or disbelief. Just a steady erosion, like the tide pulling sand away grain by grain. He lost small pots he should have won. He folded hands that might have survived. He chased just enough to stay hopeful, then paid for it with quiet regret. The table didn't attack him. It waited. That's what made it unsettling. Nobody pressured him. Nobody taunted. Nobody smiled when he lost. His losses were acknowledged with the same politeness as everything else in that room, which made them feel intentional. I watched the way the dealer distributed cards. Precise, identical motions every time. No variation. No tells. The mechanics were flawless. This wasn't sloppy. It was surgical. The nervous man wiped sweat from his brow once, then immediately seemed embarrassed by the gesture, like he'd revealed something private. He straightened his posture, forced his shoulders back, tried to look composed. The table didn't respond. It didn't need to. A few hands later, he lost again. A little more this time. Enough to sting. Enough to remind him. That's when I realized something important. No one here was trying to win quickly. They were trying to finish him. The distinction matters. Winning is aggressive. It announces itself. It creates reactions. Finishing is quiet. It's patient. It doesn't require dominance, only inevitability. That's when I realized this wasn't a game to win. It was a game to finish. The realization didn't come with panic. It came with clarity. This table wasn't built for competition. It was built for conclusion. The nervous man still believed he was playing poker, still believed that if the cards turned, if luck shifted, if he just held on a little longer, things could change. Everyone else knew better. They weren't responding to his bets. They were guiding him toward a destination. I felt my attention sharpen, my instincts lean forward, not out of fear, out of recognition. This was the same sensation I'd felt back in Oklahoma City, just before I cheated for the first time. The moment when the illusion of fairness cracked. The man checking the door did it again, just once, and this time, I understood why. The door wasn't an exit. It was a boundary. And whatever was happening at this table wasn't meant to spill beyond it. The man with the untouched drink finally reached for it, stopped halfway, then pulled his hand back, as if reminded of a rule only he could hear. That sent a chill through me. Rules you don't speak aloud are always the most dangerous. The nervous man lost another hand. His breathing changed. Shallow now, faster. His eyes darted more often, scanning faces, looking for sympathy or permission, or anything that would tell him this wasn't personal. No one gave him that. The room maintained its politeness. That was the cruelest part. Because politeness removes the right to protest. I started to wonder what he'd done to earn this. Not out of judgment, out of necessity. This wasn't random. Rooms like this don't waste time. Had he cheated? Offended someone? Won when he wasn't supposed to? Said yes to an invitation he didn't understand? Or was this simply the cost of sitting down without knowing the rules? I glanced at the dealer again. Still not looking up. That's when it hit me. The dealer wasn't observing the players because he wasn't responsible for the outcome. He was executing it. The nervous man pushed his last significant stack forward on a hand that felt desperate, not reckless, hopeful, the kind of bet you make when you need the universe to meet you halfway. The call came quickly. Too quickly. The hand played out without drama. And when it ended, the nervous man sat still for a moment longer than necessary, staring at the felt like it might offer an explanation. It didn't. His hand stopped shaking. That scared me. Not relief. Resignation. He hadn't lost yet, but something inside him had already accepted the direction of things. Around the table, no one shifted, no one leaned back, no one reacted. The machine kept turning. I felt the weight of choice settle on me then, heavier than any stack of chips. Because now I understood the environment. And once you understand it, you're no longer innocent. The question wasn't whether I could win. It was whether I could survive being noticed. The table moved on. The nervous man stayed seated. And the room, polite, controlled, observant, continued doing what it had clearly done before. Ending things. Quietly. The moment everything breaks. It happened without warning. Not suddenly, but without interruption. The losing man sat there longer than anyone else should have, staring at his chips like they were pieces of a language he no longer spoke. His hands were steady now, too steady. The shaking had left him completely, replaced by something flatter, quieter. That was the first real sign. He looked up and cleared his throat. "I'll need credit," he said. Not loudly, not defiantly. Politely. The room didn't react right away. The dealer didn't look up. He didn't pause. He didn't even change his rhythm. He finished stacking the pot from the previous hand with the same care he'd shown all night. Then, without lifting his eyes, he said, "No." One syllable. No explanation, and no apology. Just a boundary. The losing man nodded. That's what stunned me. No argument, no bargaining, no anger. He accepted the refusal like it had been expected all along, like the question itself had only been a formality. He sat back in his chair, exhaled slowly, and did something that shouldn't have been possible. He kept playing anyway. Someone slid him chips. Not many. Just enough. No one announced it. No one asked permission. It wasn't charity. It wasn't kindness. It was procedure. The chips came from a man 2 seats to his right, the one who hadn't touched his drink all night. He pushed them forward without looking at him, like he was returning something that had never really belonged to him in the first place. The losing man accepted them without thanks. That told me more than words ever could. This wasn't about debt. It was about completion. The room tightened. Not audibly, not visibly, but everyone felt it. Even the jazz downstairs seemed to pull back, its rhythm softening, as if the building itself was listening. The ceiling fan continued its slow rotation, but the air felt heavier now, harder to move through. The dealer shuffled. The sound was different this time. Slower. Deliberate. I felt my chest tighten, a strange pressure just below the sternum. The kind you get when something irreversible is about to happen, and you're powerless to stop it. No one spoke. No one needed to. The losing man sat upright, shoulders squared, eyes forward. His breathing was controlled, measured. He wasn't panicking. He was preparing. The cards were dealt. They landed on the felt with soft, final sounds. I watched his hands pick them up. Carefully. Reverently. Like he was holding something sacred. Around the table, posture changed almost imperceptibly. Men leaned back slightly, creating space. Not out of fear, but respect. Chairs shifted a few inches, not to flee, to allow. The losing man looked at his cards. I don't know what he saw. It didn't matter. He nodded once, to himself, then placed them back down, face down. He didn't protect them. He didn't glance around to read reactions. He didn't adjust his chips nervously. He simply placed his hands flat on the table. Open. Exposed. That's when the silence deepened. Not absence of sound, presence of attention. The dealer finished the round. Calls were made quickly, too quickly, no hesitation, no curiosity. Everyone already knew how this hand would resolve. The losing man stayed still. When the final card hit the felt, he exhaled. Long. Controlled. Almost relieved. And then, he didn't inhale again. At first, nothing happened. That's important. No gasp ... and no collapse ... and no drama. He remained seated, posture intact, eyes unfocused now, but still open. His chest didn't rise. The table waited. Seconds passed. 1, 2, 3. No one moved. No one checked his pulse. Nobody rushed to his side. Nobody called his name. They already knew. A chair scraped softly as someone stood, not abruptly, not alarmed, just enough movement to break the moment without disrupting it. Another man reached over and gently took the cards from the dead man's hands, stacking them neatly, aligning the edges. Chips were counted. Methodically. Efficiently. As if the hand had simply ended. One man, the one who had slid him the chips, leaned forward and closed the dead man's eyes with 2 fingers. Not hurried. Not hesitant. Respectful. I felt cold spread through my limbs. A slow numbness that wasn't fear, it was comprehension. The kind that settles in when your understanding of the world shifts and doesn't ask your permission. This wasn't negligence. This wasn't cruelty. This was ritual. No ambulance was called. No sirens broke the night. Because this room existed above interruption. What happened here, stayed here. The dealer finally looked up. Just once. Not at the body. At the table. Gentlemen, he said quietly, we'll take a moment. And that was all. The men stood, pushed their chairs back, stretched stiff limbs. Conversations didn't resume. Drinks weren't lifted. Nobody tried to lighten the mood. There was no mood to lighten. The body remained seated. Present. Acknowledged. Then, just as calmly, two men approached from the corner of the room. Men I hadn't noticed before, because they hadn't needed to be noticed. They handled the body with practiced care, guiding it out of the chair, supporting it as if it were still alive. The door opened. The jazz downstairs swelled again, ignorant and alive. The door closed, and the table was empty. Felt cleared. Chips reset. The game resumed. That was the moment everything broke inside me. Not because a man had died, but because nothing else did. No outrage. No reckoning. No pause long enough to honor the weight of what had happened. Just continuity. I understood then what this place truly was. Not a gambling room. A filter. It didn't test skill. It tested endurance. It tested whether you could sit in the presence of consequence without demanding meaning from it. The losing man hadn't lost unfairly. He hadn't been cheated. He had been finished. And everyone in that room knew exactly when it would happen, except him. I looked down at my own hands. They were steady. That terrified me, because it meant I was already adapting. And if I stayed, if I played the next hand, then whatever came next wouldn't be an accident. It would be acceptance. The dealer shuffled again. The sound was back to normal. And as the cards moved, I realized something that pressed heavy against my chest. The invitation hadn't been about money. It had been about seeing this, and deciding whether I could still sit down afterward. The next hand was coming. And whatever happened next would follow me far beyond this room. This wasn't an accident. It took me 3 blocks to realize my hands were shaking. Not the kind of shaking you get from fear. Not exactly. It was something colder, something delayed, like my body had waited for permission to react. The music from the club followed me down the stairs and spilled into the street. Trumpets, laughing, drums, refusing to care. New Orleans doing what it had always done, breathing, sweating, living completely uninterested in what had just happened one floor above. A man had died. And the city didn't even blink. I stood under a flickering streetlight and lit a cigarette with hands that no longer trusted themselves. The flame danced for a second too long before catching. I inhaled, too deep. My lungs burned, a reminder that I was still very much alive. That's when the thought arrived. Not sudden, not loud, just inevitable. This wasn't an accident. I replayed the night in my head the way poker players replay bad hands. Slowly, obsessively, searching for the moment everything tilted. The way the dealer never looked up. The way the quiet men never rushed a pot. The way no one reacted when the losing men asked for credit. They hadn't denied him with cruelty. They denied him with certainty. Because somewhere, long before that first card was dealt, the outcome had already been accepted. That man hadn't come to the table to gamble. He had come to finish something. And the table hadn't killed him. It had witnessed him. That realization sat heavier than anything I'd felt before, heavier than hunger, heavier than fear, heavier even than guilt. Because guilt implies action. I hadn't done anything. And that was the problem. I thought back to the moment he sat down, middle-aged, overdressed. His suit pressed like it wanted to impress someone who wasn't there anymore. His hands had trembled not with nerves, but with exhaustion, the kind that comes from carrying a weight too long without putting it down. I'd seen losing players before. This wasn't that. He didn't argue with the cards, didn't curse his luck, didn't challenge the dealer. He played like a man checking boxes. One hand closer, one chip lighter, one breath shorter. That's when it hit me. He didn't die because he lost. He lost because he was already dead. Not physically, not yet, but socially, financially, psychologically. Finished men don't collapse in public. They fade in private places where witnesses know how to behave. And that's what the game was. Permission. Permission to let something end without noise. The table wasn't responsible. It was complicit. And so was I. I stopped walking and leaned against a brick wall, slick with humidity and age. The streetlight buzzed above me like it was debating whether to stay on. I wondered how many people had stood in this exact spot over the years, trying to convince themselves they hadn't crossed a line. Because here's the truth no one says out loud. Lines don't announce themselves. They don't glow. They don't warn you. They wait for you to stop asking questions. I hadn't touched the man. I hadn't dealt the cards. I hadn't denied him credit. But I hadn't left either. And staying, that was the agreement. That's when I finally understood what the invitation meant. It wasn't about skill. It wasn't about trust. It was about tolerance. Can you sit at a table where this happens, and come back tomorrow? Because once you've seen it, you don't get to pretend anymore. You don't get the comfort of ignorance. You don't get to believe the game is just a game. From that night on, poker stopped being about winning. It became about proximity to consequence. How close could you sit to something irreversible without standing up? I realized something else then, something worse. No one at that table would ever speak of the man again. Not because they were heartless, but because acknowledging him would mean acknowledging themselves. And people don't survive long doing that. As I crushed the cigarette under my shoe, felt a strange, hollow clarity settle in. The kind that comes when a belief dies quietly. The belief that morality is loud, that evil announces itself, that you'll know when you're doing something unforgivable. Most of the time, you don't. Most of the time, it feels reasonable, necessary, polite. I walked away from the club without looking back. The music followed me for half a block before dissolving into traffic and humidity and memory. Somewhere behind me, the table was already being reset. Cards shuffled, chips stacked, chairs pushed back into place, ready for the next invitation. And as I headed toward my car, one thought stayed with me, heavy and answered, and aimed straight at whoever was listening. Ask yourself honestly, would you have stayed at the table or walked away? Because the scariest part isn't that a man died. It's that everyone knew it might happen. And they played anyway. And so did I. What the invitation really means. No one told me to leave. That was the strangest part. After the man stopped breathing, after the chair scraped back, after the chips were counted, after the table returned to its shape, the room didn't dissolve into chaos. It didn't empty, no doors slammed, no voices rose in panic or prayer. The game ended the way it began. Quietly. Someone opened a window, the smoke thinned, the ceiling fan kept turning, slow and lazy like it hadn't noticed a thing. The body stayed where it was, and no one looked at it anymore. I waited for instructions that never came. In places like this, silence usually means you've made a mistake, that you've overstayed your welcome, that you should already be gone. But here, silence meant something else. It meant observe. I stood near the wall, hat in my hands, watching men put on jackets as if this had been a long dinner instead of a death. One by one, they nodded to each other, not in sympathy, not in shock, but in acknowledgement. As if the night had delivered exactly what it promised. I don't know how long I stood there before he spoke to me. He hadn't been sitting at the table. He hadn't dealt a card. He hadn't placed a bet. But somehow, he felt more present than anyone else in the room. He was older, not old enough to seem fragile, but old enough that time had clearly decided to leave its mark on him. His suit wasn't expensive, but it fit perfectly. His shoes were worn in a way that suggested memory, not neglect. He didn't introduce himself. He didn't have to. Now you understand, he said. His voice wasn't loud, it wasn't cold. It carried the calm certainty of someone who had never needed to repeat himself. I didn't answer. I wasn't sure what he expected me to say. He looked past me, toward the table, where the cards were already being gathered, the felt brushed clean. This, he continued, is why we invite carefully. There it was. The word. Invite. Not allow. Not permit. Not let in. Invite. As if this had been a dinner party. As if the dead men had arrived. I felt something tighten in my chest, not fear. Not exactly. Recognition. Maybe. The slow realization that the danger hadn't been the game. It had been the audience. You could have left, he said, still not looking at me, when he asked for credit, when he stayed seated, when the room went quiet. I didn't know I was allowed to, I replied. That finally earned me a glance. A thin smile, not amused, not cruel. Informed. Exactly. We stood there for a moment, listening to the jazz downstairs. The music had shifted something slower now, heavy with brass and regret. The kind of tune that doesn't resolve itself, just keeps circling the same ache. You think this was about money, he said. Everyone does. The first time. I didn't correct him. I had thought that, even after everything. He shook his head, gently, like a teacher watching a student cling to the wrong lesson. No, he continued. Money is just how people justify staying. Pride is how they pretend they belong. But that's not what we're watching for. He finally turned to face me fully. What we watch, he said, is tolerance. The word landed heavier than I expected. Not courage, not skill, greed. Tolerance. How much discomfort, he went on, can you sit with and still show up tomorrow? I thought of the man's hands. The way they'd shaken early in the night, the way they'd gone still at the end. I thought of how no one had checked his pulse, not because they didn't care, but because it wasn't necessary. The room already knew. This wasn't a game to win, said quietly. The man nodded. It never is. For the first time, I understood the rhythm of the night. The reason the dealer never looked up. The reason one man watched the door. The reason another refused to touch his drink. They weren't nervous. They were aware. Aware of the rules that never get written down. Aware of the cost of sitting at certain tables. Aware that in some rooms, the stakes don't end when the cards are folded. You passed, the man said. I looked at him. Past what? The smile returned, faint but unmistakable. You stayed. That was it. Not that I played well. Not that I won. Not even that I kept my composure. I stayed. I didn't stand up. I didn't shout. I didn't demand explanations. I didn't pretend the night had become something else. I accepted it for what it was. And apparently, that was enough. He adjusted his cufflinks and stepped back, already losing interest. Whatever judgment had been made, it was final. These people didn't revisit decisions. They didn't debate outcomes. They observed. They selected. They moved on. Tomorrow, he said, turning away. The game continues. I watched him disappear down the stairs, his footsteps swallowed by the music below. Tomorrow? The word echoed longer than it should have. Not if. Not perhaps. Tomorrow? I looked back at the table one last time. The chair where the man had died was already pushed back into place. The felt showed no sign of disturbance. The room was resetting itself, like a stage crew preparing for the next performance. And that's when it hit me. The invitation had never been about tonight. Tonight was just the demonstration. The real question, the only one that mattered, was still hanging in the air, unanswered. Could I sit at a table where this happens? And come back tomorrow? I didn't know the answer yet. But I knew one thing. Whatever I chose next would decide far more than how the next hand played out. Because once you understand what the invitation really means, you can never pretend you didn't, crossing the line without stepping. I walked out of the building alone. The music was still playing downstairs, not louder, not softer, exactly the same. A trumpet cried somewhere in the street. Laughter spilled out of a doorway 2 blocks away. A woman leaned against a brick wall, smoking like the night owed her something. New Orleans didn't stop breathing. That was the first thing that unsettled me. I had just watched a man die at a table, not in the way movies show it, Not with chaos or screams or blood. He died quietly, respectfully, almost correctly. And yet, the city kept moving, as if nothing had been interrupted. Cars rolled past. Footsteps echoed on wet pavement. Jazz floated through open windows like a memory that refused to settle. That's when I understood something dangerous. New Orleans didn't change that night. I did. I stood under a flickering streetlight and realized my hands were steady, calm steady. There's a difference. Calm means peace. Steady means adaptation. I replayed the moment over and over, not the death itself, but the space around it. The pause, the chair sliding back, the way chips were counted while the body was still warm. Nobody checked his pulse. Nobody asked a question. Because nobody needed to. That table wasn't built for mercy. It was built for continuity. And the most unsettling part wasn't that a man died. It was that the game finished. I didn't touch him. I didn't speak. I didn't stand up. But I didn't leave either. That's the part that followed me out into the night. People like to believe sin requires action, a strike, a lie, betrayal you can point to and name. But some lines don't require movement. Some lines are crossed by staying exactly where you are. I had always told myself I was careful, that I drifted from city to city, table to table, because I wanted to avoid consequences. But that night, I learned the truth. The game was never about money. Money was just the surface. The real currency was proximity. How close could you sit to consequence, without flinching? How near could you be to something irreversible, and still come back the next night? That was the test. Not skill, luck, not nerve. Tolerance. Can you stay seated when something inside you says you shouldn't? Can you accept what the table demands, and call it maturity instead of surrender? I walked past a bar where the windows were fogged with heat and sweat. Inside, strangers leaned together like they'd known each other forever. I wondered how many of them had stayed when they should have walked away. Because here's the truth, nobody says out loud. The moment you stay, the moment you choose comfort over confrontation, you belong. Not officially, not publicly, but permanently. I didn't feel hunted when I left that building. I didn't feel threatened. I felt accepted. And that frightened me more than any danger ever had. Because danger announces itself. Acceptance whispers. It tells you you're fine, that you did nothing wrong, that survival is a good enough reason. And the city agreed. New Orleans didn't judge me. It absorbed me. That's how it works. It doesn't punish you for staying. It simply remembers that you did. I spent the rest of the night walking without direction, letting the streets decide where I went. Every corner felt like it had a history it wasn't done telling. I kept thinking about the man's face, not in the moment he died, but in the hands before it. The way he reached for his cards, like habit was stronger than fear. The way he asked for credit like hope was still an option. The way he exhaled, trusting that the table would give him one more breath. It didn't. And I realized something else then. The table didn't kill him. Expectation did. He believed the rules would protect him, that decorum meant safety, that politeness implied mercy. I had believed that once too. But now I knew better. This world doesn't reward goodness. It rewards alignment. And that night, I aligned myself without ever saying yes. I thought about leaving the city before sunrise, about disappearing back into the road, back into motion. But I didn't rush. Because somewhere deep inside, I understood. Something had shifted. I wasn't running anymore. I was being measured. Measured by what I could witness, and still return from. The invitation had never been about poker. It was about presence. Could I sit at a table where death was possible, and still shuffle cards the next night? Could I look a man in the eye, knowing what the room allowed, and not ask to leave? That's when I understood the difference between danger and acceptance. Danger tries to stop you. Acceptance waits to see how far you'll go on your own. And New Orleans had finished asking its question. I had answered without speaking. By morning, the city looked innocent again. Sunlight washed the streets clean. Tourists lined up for coffee and beignets like nothing in the world had weight. But I carried it with me. Because once you understand what the table really asks of you, you can never pretend you're just passing through again. I left New Orleans knowing one thing for certain. I hadn't been tested for skill. I had been tested for silence. And I passed. That lesson followed me out of the city, across state lines, toward a place where silence wouldn't be enough. Because, in Texas, they don't ask if you can sit still. They ask if you can prove it. Now, let me ask you something, and be honest. Question 1. Would you have stayed at the table after that, yes or no? Question 2. What city are you watching this from right now? I read every comment. Your answer says more than you think. Like the video if this story stayed with you. Subscribe to continue the journey. Because next time, I wasn't tested by silence. I was tested by invitation. And in Texas, they would ask me to prove it.